On the day we buried my father, surrounded by the cold stares of our entire family, my sister smiled like she'd just won the lottery. But she had no idea that the man lying in that mahogany casket had left me something that would forever shatter the wall of lies she'd spent years building. As the pastor droned on about forgiveness and eternal rest, I clutched the envelope the lawyer had slipped into my hand, feeling the weight of secrets that would change everything. My name is Madison Clark, and until 3 years ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was. At 34, I was the chief financial officer of Clark & Sons Development, the construction company my father built from nothing in Columbus, Ohio. I had my corner office on the 15th floor, my name etched in gold on mahogany, and the respect that came with being Thomas Clark's daughter who'd actually earned her place. It was a Tuesday morning in March when my world cracked open. I was conducting our quarterly tax review, something I'd done dozens of times before, when I noticed irregularities in our accounts receivable, hidden transactions, each one meticulously disguised, totaling over $300,000, all bearing my electronic signature, all completely foreign to me. My hands trembled as I printed each page, the evidence of what looked like systematic embezzlement stacking higher on my desk. But I hadn't signed these. I'd never even seen these accounts. Someone had used my access codes, my authorization, my name to steal from our own company. The walk to my father's office felt like a death march. Thomas Clark sat behind his massive oak desk, silver hair perfectly styled even at 7:30 in the morning, reading the Wall Street Journal with the focus of a man who'd built an empire one calculated decision at a time. "Dad, we need to talk." I spread the documents across his desk like tarot cards revealing a terrible future. "Someone's been using my credentials to authorize fraudulent transactions. We're looking at major theft here." He didn't even look up from his newspaper. "Madison, you're being paranoid again." Paranoid. The word hit me like a slap. "Dad, look at these numbers. Look at the timestamps. I was in Seattle visiting clients when half of these were processed." Finally, he set down his paper and fixed me with those gray eyes that had intimidated competitors and employees for decades. But this time, that cold stare was directed at me. "Are you sure you want to go down this road? Are you absolutely certain you want to tear this family apart over some accounting discrepancies?" The way he said it made my stomach drop. Not, "Let's investigate this," or "We'll get to the bottom of it." Just a warning dressed up as a question. "This isn't a discrepancy. Dad, this is theft. Someone forged my signature on—" "Enough!" His voice cut through the air like a blade. "I think you need to take some time off. You're clearly under stress." That night, I sat in my townhouse, staring at copies of the documents I'd made before confronting him. The evidence was right there, black and white, impossible to deny. But somehow, I was the one being treated like the criminal. My phone buzzed at 11:15 p.m. Vanessa's name lit up the screen. "Hey, little sister. Heard you had an interesting conversation with Dad today." Even through the phone, I could hear the smugness in her voice. Vanessa had always been the golden child, beautiful, charming, and utterly ruthless when it came to getting what she wanted. "Someone's stealing from the company, Vanessa, using my access codes." "Oh, Madison." Her laugh was like nails on glass. "You know, Dad's really worried about you. Ever since your divorce, you've been so unstable. First the therapy sessions, now these paranoid accusations. Maybe you should take a step back from the company until you get your head straight." The therapy. Of course she'd bring up the therapy. After my marriage to David fell apart 2 years ago, I'd spent 6 months working with a counselor to process the betrayal and rebuild my confidence. It was healthy, necessary healing that I'd been proud of. But in Vanessa's hands, it became ammunition. "This has nothing to do with my mental health. This has to do with someone committing fraud." "Does it? Though, I mean, think about it from an outside perspective. Woman goes through messy divorce, starts therapy for emotional issues, then suddenly starts making wild accusations about family members stealing money. How does that look?" The line went dead. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find my keycard deactivated. Security escorted me to my office to collect my personal items while Vanessa watched from the conference room, her arms crossed and a satisfied smile playing at her lips. "The board met this morning," Dad's assistant informed me, not meeting my eyes. "They felt it was best if you took an extended leave of absence while these allegations are investigated." But there would be no investigation. I knew that even as I packed my diplomas and family photos into a cardboard box. By the time I reached the lobby, my name was already being scrubbed from the company directory. That evening, I called my mother, desperate for someone in my family to believe me. She listened in silence as I explained everything, then sighed deeply. "Madison, honey, you know I love you, but maybe Vanessa's right. Maybe you do need some time to recalibrate." The betrayal was complete, not just Vanessa's manipulation or Dad's willful blindness, but my own mother choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. Within a week, the story had spread through our social circle like wildfire. The Clark family narrative was already set. Madison had cracked under pressure, made false accusations, and been gently removed from the company for everyone's protection. Old friends stopped returning my calls. Invitations to charity galas and country club events dried up. Even my own cousins began treating me like I was contagious. I was 28 years old, unemployed, and radioactive in the only professional community I'd ever known. The worst part wasn't losing my job or my money. It was watching my own family choose a lie over me, then convince themselves they were protecting everyone by doing it. That's when I learned that sometimes the cruelest betrayals come wrapped in concern, delivered by the people who claim to love you most. The apartment I found was a testament to how far I'd fallen. 800 square feet of beige walls and thin carpeting in a complex where the elevator worked half the time and the neighbors played music until 2 in the morning. It was what I could afford on a temp worker's salary, a universe away from the life I'd built. Every morning, I'd wake up at 6:30 and stare at the water stain on my ceiling, shaped like a map of some country I'd never visit. The silence was the worst part. No phone calls from contractors, no emails about project deadlines, no urgent meetings that made me feel essential. Just the hollow echo of a life that had been completely erased. I took whatever work I could find. Data entry for a medical billing company, bookkeeping for a small law firm that paid cash under the table, administrative work at a nonprofit that couldn't afford to run background checks. Each job was temporary, forgettable, designed for someone just passing through, which, I suppose, is exactly what I'd become. The hardest part wasn't the work, it was the careful dance of avoiding my past. When coworkers asked what I'd done before, I'd developed a repertoire of vague responses. Corporate finance, family business, ready for a change, never specific enough to invite follow-up questions, never honest enough to feel real. During lunch breaks, I'd sit in my car and watch normal people live their normal lives. Women my age in business suits, talking on phones about quarterly reports and client meetings. The life I should have been living. Sometimes I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to call Dad about a construction project I'd seen, or to text Vanessa about some family gossip before reality crashed back down. My old friends had made their choice clear through silence. No returned calls, no responses to the few texts I'd sent in those first desperate weeks. Sarah, who'd been my maid of honor, Julie, who I'd helped through her own divorce. Even my college roommate Emma had simply vanished, as if our 15 years of friendship had never happened. Vanessa's version of events had spread like poison through our social circle, and no one wanted to be contaminated by association. The holidays were the cruelest reminders. Thanksgiving came and went without so much as a text from my family. I spent it volunteering at a soup kitchen, ladling mashed potatoes for strangers while imagining my family gathered around Mom's dining room table, probably relieved by my absence. Christmas was worse. I caught myself buying presents I'd never give, cards I'd never send. The isolation did something to your mind, made you question your own memories, your own sanity. Late at night, staring at those documents I'd copied before everything fell apart. I'd sometimes wonder if I really had signed those authorizations and simply forgotten, if the stress of the divorce had affected me more than I'd realized, if Vanessa was right about my mental state. But then I'd remember the timestamps, the pattern of transactions, the way Dad's eyes had looked right through me when I'd brought him the evidence, the satisfied smile on Vanessa's face as security walked me out. Those details were sharp and clear, untainted by doubt. I developed routines to keep myself sane. Morning coffee at the same diner, where the waitress knew to bring my order without asking. Evening walks through neighborhoods where I'd never lived, past houses full of families I'd never know. Weekend trips to libraries in different parts of the city where I could sit among strangers and pretend to belong somewhere. The temp agency eventually placed me with a small accounting firm that specialized in nonprofit organizations. The owner, Mr. Rodriguez, was a quiet man in his 60s who asked few questions and paid promptly. It wasn't much, but it was steady work that used at least some of my skills. "You're overqualified for this," he told me one afternoon as I finished reconciling their monthly books in half the time it usually took. "I'm exactly where I need to be," I replied, and meant it. There was something peaceful about small numbers, simple transactions, work that had clear beginnings and ends. But peace wasn't the same as contentment. Every month, I'd drive past the Clark & Sons building, watching the construction crews come and go, seeing my old life continue without me. The company was thriving. According to the Business Journal articles I couldn't stop myself from reading. New contracts, expanded operations, record profits, as if I'd never existed at all. Sometimes I'd see familiar faces in those articles. Vanessa, always Vanessa, quoted as the new chief operating officer, talking about family values and ethical business practices with a straight face. The irony was so thick I could taste it. The anger was a living thing inside me, fed by every sleepless night and every day of exile, but it was useless anger, with nowhere to go and no outlet for expression. So I learned to live with it, to carry it like a chronic ache that you eventually stop noticing. 3 years. 3 years of existing instead of living, of surviving instead of thriving. 3 years of believing that this diminished life was all I'd ever have again. I'd almost convinced myself that maybe this was enough, the small apartment, the temporary work, the careful anonymity. Then my phone rang at 8:45 on a Tuesday morning. Mom's number flashed on the screen, the first time she'd called in over a year. "Madison." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "Your father had a heart attack yesterday evening. He's gone." The words hit me like physical blows. Gone. After 3 years of silence, of being erased from his life, of having my very existence denied, he was simply gone. "The funeral is Thursday at 2 o'clock, she continued. "St. Michael's. I thought you should know." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there in my tiny kitchen, holding the phone and trying to process what I'd just heard. My father was dead, and I was being informed like a distant acquaintance, an afterthought. But despite everything, the betrayal, the exile, the complete destruction of my life, he was still my father, and I would be at that funeral, regardless of what anyone in my family wanted. I had no idea that his death would be the key to everything I'd lost, or that the man who'd chosen to believe lies over his own daughter had left me the one thing that would finally set the record straight. The morning of the funeral, I stood in front of my closet staring at the single black dress I owned, a simple, unremarkable thing I'd bought for job interviews that never led anywhere. It felt fitting, somehow. The woman who'd once owned designer suits and silk blouses was gone. This was who I was now. St. Michael's Church looked exactly the same as it had during my childhood, towering stone arches, stained glass windows casting colored shadows across worn wooden pews. But walking through those doors felt like entering enemy territory. The moment I stepped inside, conversations stopped. Heads turned. The whispers started immediately. "That's her." Can't believe she had the nerve to show up. After what she did to the family? I kept my eyes forward and chose a pew near the back, far from the reserved section where my family sat like royalty holding court. Vanessa was impossible to miss in the front row, dressed in an elegant black designer dress that probably cost more than my rent. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless even through her theatrical tears. She looked like a grieving daughter from a movie, beautiful, dignified, surrounded by comfort and support. I sat alone. The service began with all the pomp and ceremony that Thomas Clark would have expected. Father Morrison spoke about Dad's contributions to the community, his business acumen, his devotion to family. Each word felt like a knife twist, especially the parts about family values and loyalty. I wondered if anyone else in that church knew the irony of praising a man's devotion to family while his own daughter sat in exile. Vanessa delivered the eulogy with practiced grace, her voice breaking at all the right moments. She spoke about Dad's wisdom, his guidance, his unwavering support for those he loved. She talked about how he'd taught them the importance of integrity and truth. The audience hung on every word, moved by her performance. Thomas Clark was a man who saw through deception, she said, her eyes finding mine across the crowded church. He had an uncanny ability to recognize those who would betray the family's trust. In his final years, he showed tremendous grace in handling difficult family situations with dignity and forgiveness. The message was clear. Even at his funeral, she was still spinning the narrative, still painting me as the villain in our family's story. After the eulogy, people began approaching the family to offer condolences. I watched from my distant pew as friends and business associates shook hands with Mom and hugged Vanessa, offering support and sharing memories. No one looked in my direction. It was as if I wasn't even there. Then Mr. Harrison, the family's longtime attorney, approached the lectern. He was a distinguished man in his 70s who'd handled our legal affairs for decades. I'd expected him to close the service with some final words, but instead he pulled out an envelope. "Before we conclude," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the church, Thomas Clark left specific instructions for me to read a personal letter at his funeral. A murmur of interest rippled through the congregation. Mom and Vanessa exchanged glances, clearly surprised by this development. Mr. Harrison opened the envelope and began to read in his clear, professional voice. "To my family, friends, and colleagues gathered here today, if you're hearing this, then I've finally been called home, and it's time for some long overdue honesty." The church fell completely silent. 3 years ago, I made a decision that has haunted me every day since. I chose to believe allegations against my daughter Madison without proper investigation. I chose family peace over family justice. I chose the easy path over the right path. I felt the blood drain from my face. Around me, people were turning to stare, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Madison Clark never stole from our company. She never betrayed our family's trust. She was guilty of nothing more than discovering the truth and having the courage to speak it. For 3 years, I've watched my daughter live in exile for crimes she didn't commit, and I've done nothing to correct this injustice. Vanessa shot to her feet. "This is ridiculous. He was medicated, confused." "Please," Mr. Harrison interrupted firmly. "Let me finish reading Mr. Clark's words." "Madison, if you're here, and I pray that you are, I need you to know that I believe you. I've always believed you. But I was a coward who chose the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. I failed you as a father, and I failed our family by allowing this deception to continue." The silence in the church was deafening. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me, but all I could focus on was the lawyer's voice reading my father's confession. "I cannot undo the damage I've caused, but I can try to make amends. Madison, everything I built the company, the properties, the investments, it's all yours. You are the sole beneficiary of my estate and the rightful owner of Clark & Sons Development. You are also the only person I trust to uncover the full truth of what happened 3 years ago." Vanessa's face had gone white. "This is insane! He was on medication! He wasn't thinking clearly!" But Mr. Harrison continued reading. "I know there will be challenges to this decision. There will be claims that I wasn't of sound mind. That's why I've taken the precaution of having this will, witnessed by 3 independent doctors and recorded on video at the hospital just last week. I was fully competent when I made these decisions." The lawyer folded the letter and looked directly at me. "The full legal will is much more detailed, but the essential points are clear. Madison Clark is the sole inheritor of the Clark estate and the new owner of Clark & Sons Development, effective immediately." The church erupted. Vanessa was shouting something about mental incompetence and legal challenges. Mom sat frozen in shock. People were talking over each other, voices rising in confusion and disbelief. But I barely heard any of it. All I could think about was my father's words, "I've always believed you." For 3 years, I'd carried the weight of thinking that even my own father had believed I was a thief and a liar. Now, in death, he'd given me something more valuable than money or property. He'd given me vindication. I stood up slowly, every eye in the church tracking my movement. I didn't look at Vanessa, whose face was twisted with rage and panic. I didn't look at my mother, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the past 5 minutes. I walked down that center aisle with my head high for the first time in 3 years. At the door, Mr. Harrison was waiting for me. "There's more," he said quietly, pressing an envelope into my hand. "Much more. Your father left very specific instructions about what you're to receive and when, but not here. Too many ears." I nodded, clutching the envelope like a lifeline. "There's also this." He handed me a small USB drive. "He said you'd know what to do with it when the time was right." I looked back once at the chaos I was leaving behind. Vanessa was in animated conversation with several people, probably already planning her legal challenge. Mom was being comforted by church ladies who looked more excited by the drama than genuinely sympathetic. But I was done being a spectator in my own story. For 3 years, I'd been the victim of their narrative. Now it was time to write my own ending. The war wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. But for the first time since this nightmare started, I held the weapons to fight back. I drove straight home from the church, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The envelope and USB drive sat on my passenger seat like unexploded bombs, and I couldn't bring myself to look at them until I was safely inside my apartment with the door locked and the curtains drawn. The envelope contained a handwritten letter in Dad's familiar scrawl, each word carefully formed despite what must have been the weakness of his final days. I poured myself a glass of wine, the cheap kind that had become my standard, and sat down to read the last words my father would ever say to me. "My dearest Madison," it began, and I had to stop reading to wipe my eyes. He hadn't called me that since I was a child. "By now, you've heard my public confession, and I pray it brings you some measure of peace. But there are things I couldn't say in that church, truths that would have destroyed more than just reputations. I need you to understand how this all happened, and why I made the choices I did. 3 years ago, when you brought me those financial documents, I already knew about the theft. I'd discovered it myself weeks earlier during a private audit. But the person responsible wasn't a stranger using your credentials. It was Vanessa. Your sister had been systematically embezzling money for almost 2 years, covering her tracks by routing the transactions through your access codes. Well, when you confronted me with the evidence, I panicked. I thought if I could handle it quietly, keep it in the family, maybe we could avoid a scandal that would destroy everything I'd built. I convinced myself that protecting the family business was worth more than protecting my daughter's reputation. I was wrong. I was so terribly, catastrophically wrong. I let Vanessa manipulate the narrative. I watched her paint you as unstable, watched her turn your strength in seeking therapy after your divorce into evidence of mental illness. I stayed silent when she manufactured evidence of your supposed breakdown. I even helped her stage that board meeting where you were voted out. telling myself it was temporary, that I'd find a way to fix it later. But later never came. The lies grew bigger, more complex. Your mother believed them. Your friends believed them. Eventually, even I started to wonder if we'd done the right thing. Vanessa was so convincing, so passionate in her certainty that this was best for everyone. She made it easy to choose the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. The enclosed USB drive contains everything you'll need to prove your innocence and expose Vanessa's crimes. Security footage showing her in your office after hours, email chains where she planned your downfall, audio recordings of her admitting to forging documents, bank records showing where the stolen money actually went to cover her gambling debts and maintain the lifestyle she thought she deserved. I also need you to know that despite what happened, you were never actually removed as co-founder of Clark & Sons Development. The board meeting that voted you out was a sham. I never filed the paperwork with the state. Legally, you've remained a founding partner this entire time. Vanessa doesn't know this. Neither does anyone else. Use this knowledge wisely, my darling girl. Take back what was stolen from you, not just the money or the position, but your reputation and your place in this family. I can't undo the damage I've caused, but I can give you the tools to do it yourself. I love you. I'm sorry. I hope someday you can forgive a foolish old man who let fear override love. Your father, Thomas. I set the letter down with trembling hands and reached for the USB drive. My laptop was ancient, a refurbished model I'd bought secondhand, but it read the drive without issue. What I found inside was a prosecutor's dream months of meticulously organized evidence that painted a clear picture of systematic fraud and deliberate character assassination. The security footage was damning. There was Vanessa, clear as day, entering my office at 11:15 on a Tuesday night, using a master key she'd somehow obtained. The timestamp matched one of the fraudulent transactions perfectly. She spent 47 minutes at my computer, and when she left, she was carrying a box of documents that had been on my desk. The email chains were even worse. Conversations between Vanessa and various board members where she carefully planted seeds of doubt about my mental state. Messages to family friends suggesting I was struggling and needed space to heal. Communications with our IT department requesting access to system logs, which she then used to cover her tracks while implicating me. But the audio recordings were the smoking gun. Dad had apparently been recording conversations for months before his death, building a case against his own daughter while battling his conscience about his other daughter's exile. In one particularly clear recording, Vanessa's voice came through my laptop speakers with crystal clarity. The beauty of it is that Madison's therapy gives us the perfect cover story. Who's going to believe an emotionally unstable woman over the entire rest of the family, and even if she tries to fight it? We have the forged resignation letter with her signature. I practiced that signature for weeks. It's perfect. There were bank records showing the gambling debts, credit card statements revealing a lifestyle far beyond what her company salary could support, and most damaging of all, a detailed email to someone named Marcus discussing how to neutralize the Madison problem permanently by ensuring she could never work in finance again. I sat back in my cheap desk chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was looking at. This wasn't just evidence of theft, it was evidence of a calculated campaign to destroy my life, orchestrated by my own sister and enabled by my father's cowardice. My phone had been buzzing constantly since I'd left the church. Voicemails from Mr. Harrison, text messages from numbers I didn't recognize, and several missed calls from Vanessa herself. I deleted them all without listening or reading. Whatever chaos was erupting in the wake of Dad's revelation could wait. But one voicemail made me pause. It was from James Mitchell, the current chairman of Clark & Sons Board of Directors and one of Dad's oldest friends. Madison, it's Jim Mitchell. I know this day has been overwhelming, but we need to talk as soon as possible. There are some things about the company structure you need to know, and some decisions that need to be made quickly. Vanessa is already making calls, talking about contesting the will and maintaining operational control. Please call me back tonight. This can't wait until morning. I saved the message and looked at the clock, 7:35 p.m. The funeral had been 6 hours ago, and Vanessa was already mobilizing for war. But this time, I wouldn't be fighting defenseless. I made copies of everything on the USB drive, storing them in multiple locations and uploading backup files to a secure cloud account. Then I called Mr. Harrison. "I've reviewed the materials," I told him when he answered on the first ring. And I'm ready to take back what's mine. All of it." There was a pause, then a sound that might have been relief. "Good, because your sister filed for an emergency injunction this afternoon, claiming the will is invalid and demanding immediate control of company operations. The hearing is tomorrow at 9 a.m. "Then I guess I'll see her in court." "Madison," his voice was gentle but firm, "are you prepared for how ugly this is going to get? She's not going to go quietly." I looked at my reflection in the black computer screen, seeing not the broken woman who'd lived in exile for 3 years, but the fighter I'd forgotten I could be. "Mr. Harrison, I've been living in hell for 3 years because of her lies. Trust me, I'm ready for ugly." I spent that entire night going through every file on the USB drive, taking notes and organizing the evidence into a timeline that even a child could follow. By 4:30 in the morning, I had built an airtight case that would not only prove my innocence but expose Vanessa as the architect of a multi-year conspiracy that had destroyed my life while she profited from my exile. The most damning piece wasn't the financial records or even the security footage. It was a document I almost missed, buried in a subfolder labeled Insurance. It was a resignation letter bearing my signature, dated the day after I'd been escorted from the building. The letter formally relinquished all my rights as co-founder and authorized the transfer of my shares to the remaining family members. Except I'd never written that letter. I'd never even seen it before. But Vanessa had been thorough in her deception. She'd used company letterhead, formal legal language, even included references to my emotional distress and need for distance from family business obligations. The signature looked perfect, too perfect. I pulled out examples of my real signature from old documents and compared them under a magnifying glass I'd bought for reading fine print on temp job contracts. The forgery was excellent, but it wasn't flawless. The pressure on certain letters was wrong, the spacing slightly off. Most telling was the way she'd dotted the I in Madison. I always used a small circle, a quirky habit from childhood, but this signature showed a traditional dot. It was the kind of detail that would seem insignificant unless you knew what to look for. I also found the real prize buried in Dad's email archives, a thread between him and the company's legal counsel, discussing the fact that my co-founder status had never been legally terminated. The resignation letter had never been filed with the State Corporation Commission. In the eyes of the law, I'd remained a founding partner of Clark & Sons Development, even while living in exile. "This means she's been operating under false pretenses for 3 years. I whispered to my empty apartment. Every decision she made, every contract she signed as acting co-founder, it was all unauthorized. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp. I arrived at the courthouse at 8:15, dressed in my single professional outfit, a navy blazer and skirt I'd bought for job interviews, paired with shoes that had been resoled twice. Mr. Harrison was waiting on the courthouse steps, impeccably dressed as always, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "You look ready for battle," he said, extending his hand. "I've been ready for 3 years. I just didn't have the weapons before." Inside the courtroom, Vanessa sat at the plaintiff's table surrounded by an army of attorneys in expensive suits. She'd changed from her funeral dress into a sharp black power suit that screamed competence and authority. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore just enough makeup to look professional but still grief-stricken. Even her posture was calculated straight-backed, but with just a slight slump to suggest the weight of sudden responsibility. She looked like exactly what she was pretending to be, a capable businesswoman thrust into leadership by tragic circumstances, forced to clean up the mess left by an unstable sibling. When she saw me walk in, her mask slipped for just a fraction of a second. I caught a flash of pure hatred before she composed herself and leaned over to whisper something to her lead attorney. Judge Morrison, no relation to the priest who'd conducted Dad's funeral, was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every trick in the book. She called the hearing to order at exactly 9 o'clock. Vanessa's attorney, a silver-haired man who introduced himself as Robert Sterling, stood to present their case. His argument was polished and persuasive. Thomas Clark had been under extreme duress following his heart attack, medicated and not thinking clearly when he'd made his final will. The true wishes of the deceased were reflected in years of business decisions that had consistently supported Vanessa's leadership, while Madison had shown herself to be unstable and unfit for corporate responsibility. "Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to winning. "The plaintiff has been successfully managing Clark & Sons development for 3 years. She has increased profits by 37%, expanded operations into 2 new markets, and maintained the stellar reputation that Thomas Clark spent decades building. To suddenly transfer control to someone who was removed from the company for cause would be devastating to the business and unfair to the employees who depend on stable leadership." He painted a picture of Vanessa as the responsible daughter who'd stepped up when family tragedy struck, contrasting her with me, the troubled sister who'd made wild accusations and then disappeared rather than face the consequences. It was a masterful performance, and I could see some of the court personnel nodding along. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have been convinced myself. Then it was our turn. Mr. Harrison stood slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "Your Honor, this case is not about business management or family dynamics. It's about fraud, forgery, and a 3-year conspiracy to steal both money and reputation from an innocent woman." He began with the forged resignation letter, projecting it onto a screen for the entire courtroom to see. Then he showed examples of my real signature, pointing out the subtle but crucial differences that proved the document was fake. "Madison Clark never resigned from Clark & Sons Development," he said. "This letter is a forgery, created to provide legal cover for what was essentially a corporate coup. Ms. Vanessa Clark has been operating for 3 years under the false assumption that she had legal authority she never actually possessed." Vanessa's attorney objected, claiming the documents were irrelevant and potentially fabricated, but Judge Morrison overruled him and instructed Mr. Harrison to continue. What followed was a systematic destruction of every lie Vanessa had built. The security footage showing her in my office, the email chains planning my downfall, the audio recordings where she admitted to forging documents and manipulating the narrative. But the piece de resistance was a financial analysis that Mr. Harrison had prepared overnight, showing exactly where the stolen money had gone, not to business expenses or family emergencies, but to pay off gambling debts at 3 different casinos and to fund a lifestyle that included a luxury apartment she'd been hiding from the family. "The defendant didn't just steal money," Mr. Harrison said, his voice rising with controlled anger. "She stole her sister's life, her reputation, her place in the family. She orchestrated a campaign of character assassination so thorough that an innocent woman spent 3 years believing she might actually be guilty of crimes she never committed." By the time he finished presenting the evidence, the courtroom was completely silent. Vanessa sat frozen at her table, her face pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Her attorneys were frantically whispering among themselves, clearly realizing their case had just evaporated. Judge Morrison reviewed the documents for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim. "Mr. Sterling, does your client wish to respond to these allegations?" Sterling stood shakily. "Your Honor, we need time to review this new evidence and prepare a response." "I'm sure you do." The judge's tone was dry. "However, the evidence presented appears to be comprehensive and compelling. More importantly, it directly addresses the central question of this hearing, whether Thomas Clark's final will represents his true intentions or the product of diminished capacity. She turned to look directly at me. Ms. Clark, based on the evidence presented, it appears your father was not only of sound mind when he made his final will, but was actively working to correct a grave injustice. The will stands as written. The gavel came down with finality that seemed to echo through my bones. I had won. After 3 years of exile, 3 years of believing I might be crazy, 3 years of living as a ghost of my former self, I had finally, definitively won. But as I looked across the courtroom at Vanessa, whose face had crumpled into something between rage and despair, I realized this was just the beginning. The legal battle was over, but the real war, the fight to reclaim my place in the world and make her pay for what she'd stolen, was just getting started. The Clark & Sons development building stood exactly as I remembered it, 15 floors of glass and steel reaching toward the Columbus sky, the company logo gleaming in brushed steel letters across the entrance. But walking through those doors felt like stepping into a parallel universe where I was both stranger and owner, exile and empress. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon. Mr. Harrison had insisted we move quickly, before Vanessa could regroup and mount any kind of counteroffensive. Word of the morning's court decision had already spread through the building's corridors like wildfire, and I could feel the weight of curious stares as we made our way to the executive conference room. The board of directors was already assembled when we arrived, 8 men and women who had known me since I was a child, who had watched me grow up in this company, and who had voted me out 3 years ago without a single dissenting voice. Now they sat around the mahogany table like a jury unsure of their verdict, their faces carefully neutral as I took my seat at the head of the table, Dad's chair, now legally mine. James Mitchell, the board chairman, cleared his throat. Madison, I think I speak for everyone when I say how surprised we were by today's revelations. We had no idea about the extent of— Let me stop you right there. Jim, I kept my voice level, professional. We're not here to discuss your surprise or your ignorance. We're here to address the fact that this company has been operating under fraudulent leadership for 3 years, and that several members of this board participated in what amounts to a corporate coup based on fabricated evidence. The room went silent. In the old days, before my exile, I'd been the diplomatic one, always smoothing over conflicts and finding middle ground. That Madison was gone. The evidence presented in court this morning proves beyond doubt that I never resigned from my position as co-founder, that the documents used to justify my removal were forged, and that the allegations against me were part of a deliberate campaign orchestrated by Vanessa Clark. I opened my laptop and connected it to the conference room's presentation system. What you're about to see is security footage from this building, taken 3 years ago. The video began playing on the large screen at the end of the room. There was Vanessa, clear as day, using a master key to enter my office at 11:15 p.m., staying for 47 minutes, and leaving with a box of documents. The timestamp corresponded exactly with one of the fraudulent transactions that had been attributed to me. This footage was provided to the police 3 years ago, I continued, but somehow never made it into the internal investigation that led to my removal. Can anyone explain how that happened? Board member Patricia Wells shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Madison, we relied on the information provided by your father and— My father, who has now confessed in writing that he knew I was innocent. I clicked to the next slide, displaying excerpts from Dad's letter. My father, who documented Vanessa's crimes and left detailed evidence of her guilt. My father, who never actually filed the paperwork to remove me as co-founder because he knew I was innocent. The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming. Several board members were studying their hands, unable to meet my eyes. According to the company's articles of incorporation, I continued, any decision to remove a founding member requires not just a board vote, but also proper legal documentation filed with the state. Since that documentation was never filed, my removal was invalid from day one. Every decision made by this board over the past 3 years that relied on my supposed resignation has no legal standing. Jim Mitchell's face had gone ashen. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying that Vanessa Clark has been operating without authority for 3 years. Every contract she signed, every financial decision she made, every strategic initiative she implemented, all of it was done by someone who had no legal right to act on behalf of this company. I could see the implications hitting them like falling dominoes. The liability exposure alone could destroy the company. If competitors or disgruntled clients discovered that Clark & Sons had been operating under false pretenses for 3 years, the lawsuits would be endless. However, I said, letting the word hang in the air, I'm not here to burn down what my father built. I'm here to restore legitimate leadership and address the criminal activity that has been covered up for far too long. I clicked to the next slide, showing a financial analysis of the embezzled funds. $347,000 was stolen from this company over a 2-year period. The money was used to pay gambling debts and fund a lifestyle that Vanessa's salary couldn't support. Every dollar can be traced, and every transaction was deliberately routed through my access codes to frame me for her crimes. Board member Robert Kim leaned forward. What do you want from us? Madison. I want a formal vote acknowledging that my removal was invalid and that I am resuming my position as co-founder and majority owner, as specified in my father's will. I want Vanessa Clark terminated immediately and stripped of all authority and access to company systems, and I want a full internal audit of every decision made during the past 3 years to determine the extent of potential liability. And if we refuse, Patricia Wells asked, though her voice lacked conviction. I smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Then I exercise my rights as majority owner to dissolve the current board and appoint new directors. The choice is yours. Work with me to clean up this mess, or be replaced by people who will. The vote was 8-0 in favor of my demands. Even the board members who had been closest to Vanessa couldn't argue with the mountain of evidence or the legal reality of my position. There's one more thing, I said as they prepared to leave. Effective immediately. All of Vanessa's access codes are to be revoked, her corporate credit cards are canceled, her company car is to be returned, and security is to escort her from the building if she attempts to enter. Jim Mitchell nodded grimly. She's actually in her office right now. Security called earlier to report that she came in through the executive entrance about an hour ago. Perfect. I had wondered when she would make her move, and now I knew. Then let's go welcome her back to reality. We took the elevator to the 14th floor, where the executive offices were located. Vanessa's corner office, the one that should have been mine, had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Through the glass walls, I could see her frantically stuffing documents into a briefcase while talking rapidly on her phone. She looked up as our procession approached, and for a moment, our eyes met through the glass. The woman who had smiled so smugly at Dad's funeral was gone, replaced by someone who looked cornered and desperate. I knocked on her door and walked in without waiting for permission. After all, it was my building now. Hello, Vanessa. I think it's time we had a conversation. She straightened up, trying to summon some of her old arrogance, but I could see the fear in her eyes. You can't just waltz in here and… Actually, I can, as of 2 hours ago. I'm the majority owner of this company. You, on the other hand, are a terminated employee who's currently committing trespassing and potentially theft by removing company documents. Her phone was still pressed to her ear, and I could hear a man's voice on the other end asking what was happening. Whoever that is, I said calmly, you should probably tell them that your 3-year reign is over. The truth has a way of catching up, doesn't it? She hung up the phone with shaking hands and set it down on the desk, my father's desk, in what should have been my office. The board has voted unanimously to terminate your employment and revoke all your access to company systems. I continued. Security will escort you out, and you have exactly 15 minutes to collect your personal belongings. Everything else stays here. You can't do this to me, she whispered, but there was no conviction in her words. I'm not doing this to you, Vanessa. You did this to yourself the moment you decided to steal from our family and destroy my life to cover it up. I turned to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and one more thing. The district attorney's office will be receiving a complete file of evidence regarding your embezzlement and fraud by end of business today. You might want to call a criminal lawyer instead of whatever corporate attorney you were just talking to." As I walked away, I could hear her starting to cry real tears this time, not the theatrical grief she'd performed at Dad's funeral, but I felt no satisfaction in her breakdown, only the cold certainty that justice was finally being served. The war wasn't over yet. There would be criminal proceedings, civil lawsuits, and the long work of rebuilding both the company and my reputation. But for the first time in 3 years, I was fighting from a position of strength instead of defending from a place of exile. Vanessa had taught me that family could be the cruelest enemy of all. Now I was about to teach her that truth, when finally revealed, was the most devastating weapon in existence. 2 weeks after Vanessa's termination, I was settling into my restored office when my assistant knocked on the door with a grim expression. "Madison, you need to see this morning's Columbus Business Journal." The headline made my blood run cold. "Clark & Sons founder under investigation for financial improprieties." Below, it was a photograph of me looking haggard and defensive, clearly taken with a telephoto lens during one of my darkest moments 3 years ago, paired with a recent glamour shot of Vanessa looking professional and composed. The article was a masterpiece of character assassination disguised as journalism. It painted me as an unstable woman who had returned to claim a company after years of absence, while portraying Vanessa as a dedicated executive who had heroically kept the family business afloat during Madison Clark's troubled period. The piece cited anonymous sources close to the family, who expressed concerns about my mental health and suggested that my father's deathbed had been made under duress. Most damaging were the carefully selected quotes that made it sound like I had manipulated a dying man to steal my sister's rightful inheritance. The article mentioned my history of mental health treatment and suggested that my sudden reappearance raised questions about my fitness to run a major construction company. I called Mr. Harrison immediately. "How did they get this information, and how do we respond?" "Vanessa's fighting back," he said grimly. "She can't challenge the will legally anymore, but she can wage a public relations war. This kind of coverage could seriously damage the company's reputation and make it difficult for you to rebuild business relationships." He was right. By the time I arrived at the office, I could already see the impact. 2 scheduled client meetings had been postponed indefinitely, and our receptionist mentioned that several vendors had called with concerns about payment schedules. In the construction business, reputation was everything, and Vanessa was systematically poisoning mine. But she had made one crucial mistake. She was fighting dirty against someone who now had nothing left to lose. That afternoon, I called an emergency meeting with our corporate communications team, a group of professionals who had been carefully neutral during the leadership transition, but were now clearly worried about their jobs. "I need you to prepare a comprehensive media package," I told them. "Full documentation of the evidence presented in court, copies of the security footage, transcripts of the audio recordings where Vanessa admits to forging documents, everything." Sarah Rodriguez, our head of communications, looked uncomfortable. "Madison, are you sure you want to escalate this? Once we release something like that, there's no taking it back." "There's already no taking it back," I replied. "She's chosen to make this a public battle. Now she gets to live with the consequences." But I wasn't just going to react to her attacks. I was going to anticipate them. Working with a private investigator that Mr. Harrison recommended, we began documenting every aspect of Vanessa's financial situation. What we found was even worse than I'd imagined. The gambling debts were just the tip of the iceberg. Vanessa had been living a completely fabricated lifestyle, funded not just by stolen company money, but by loans she'd taken against the expectation of inheriting the business. She owed money to 3 different casinos, had maxed out 6 credit cards, and had borrowed against a condo she didn't actually own. More damaging was the trail of communications we uncovered between her and Marcus Webb, a business journalist who'd been feeding her inside information about planned articles in exchange for exclusive access to family sources, the same journalist who'd written the hit piece in the Columbus Business Journal. We also discovered that she'd been shopping a book proposal to publishers, Betrayed by Blood: How I Saved My Family's Business from My Sister's Mental Breakdown. The proposal included detailed plans to portray me as a cautionary tale about untreated mental illness in corporate leadership. On Friday morning, exactly 1 week after the Columbus Business Journal article ran, we held a press conference at the company's headquarters. I stood at a podium in our main conference room, facing a crowd of local business reporters, with a table full of evidence behind me. 3 weeks ago, my father, Thomas Clark, passed away and left me a legacy more valuable than money or property. I began. He left me the truth. I started with the basics: the forged resignation letter, the security footage, the financial records showing the theft. But then I moved on to the recent discoveries: the emails between Vanessa and Marcus Webb, the book proposal that revealed her plans to profit from my destruction, and the financial records showing the full extent of her debts and deceptions. Vanessa Clark didn't just steal money from this company, I said, my voice steady and clear. She stole 3 years of my life, destroyed my reputation, and separated me from my family through a calculated campaign of lies and manipulation. And when the truth finally came out, instead of taking responsibility, she doubled down and tried to destroy me again through manufactured media coverage. I held up a copy of the Columbus Business Journal article. This piece was written by a journalist who had been receiving inside information from my sister in exchange for favorable coverage. The anonymous sources quoted in this article were all Vanessa herself, speaking under different pretenses to create the illusion of multiple concerned parties. The room erupted in questions, but I wasn't finished. I want to be absolutely clear about something. I continued, I don't want revenge. I want justice. I want the truth to be heard, and I want everyone to understand that the Madison Clark who was portrayed as unstable and vindictive never existed. She was a character created by someone who needed a villain to justify her own crimes. The questions came fast and sharp. How long had I known about the manipulation? What was my response to concerns about my mental fitness? Did I plan to pursue criminal charges? I answered each one directly and honestly, providing documentation for every claim. By the end of the conference, it was clear that the narrative had shifted completely. The reporters who had come expecting to grill an unstable executive instead found themselves documenting one of the most comprehensive cases of corporate fraud and family betrayal in Columbus history. The follow-up coverage was swift and devastating for Vanessa. The Columbus Business Journal issued a public apology and fired Marcus Webb. 2 other publications that had been preparing similar hit pieces quietly killed their stories. Local television stations began running investigative pieces about the Clark family scandal. But this time, Vanessa was the villain. But the most satisfying moment came 3 days later, when I received a call from District Attorney Patricia Williams. Ms. Clark, I wanted to let you know that we've completed our review of the evidence you provided. We'll be filing formal charges against your sister tomorrow morning: embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Given the amount involved and the sophistication of the scheme, she's looking at significant prison time. I thanked her and hung up, then sat quietly in my father's chair, my chair now looking out at the Columbus skyline. For 3 years, I'd lived in exile, believing that truth was fragile and easily destroyed. I'd learned that the opposite was true. Truth was like bedrock, and no matter how much dirt you piled on top of it, eventually it would emerge. Vanessa had tried to bury me with lies, but all she'd really done was give me the time and motivation to dig down to the bedrock. And now that I'd found it, I was building something stronger than what came before. The war was almost over, but first, I had one final move to make, one that would ensure Vanessa's defeat was as complete and public as my exile had been. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of Clark & Sons Development watching the installation crew mount a new nameplate beside the elevator bank. The brushed steel letters gleamed under the morning light. Madison Clark, co-founder and CEO. It was a small thing, really, just a name on a wall. But after 3 years of being erased, of having my very existence denied by my own family, seeing those letters felt like resurrection. The company had not only survived the scandal, but thrived. Once the truth came out, clients who had distanced themselves during the controversy returned with apologies and new contracts. Employees who had watched my exile in uncomfortable silence now approached me with stories of their own doubts about Vanessa's version of events. The construction industry, it turned out, had long memories for both betrayal and vindication. Vanessa's criminal trial had concluded 2 weeks earlier. The evidence was so overwhelming that her attorneys had advised her to accept a plea bargain, 4 years in federal prison for embezzlement and fraud, plus full restitution of the stolen funds. She'd sat in that courtroom looking smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her own lies finally collapsing around her. I hadn't felt triumph watching her sentencing. If anything, I felt sadness for the sister I'd once known, or thought I'd known. The woman who'd orchestrated my destruction bore little resemblance to the girl who'd shared my childhood, who'd helped me through my parents' rocky periods, who'd once been my closest ally. But perhaps that woman had never really existed. Perhaps I'd been seeing what I wanted to see, believing in a version of Vanessa that was as carefully constructed as the lies she'd told about me. My mother had reached out after the trial, leaving voicemails that I hadn't returned. Apologies felt meaningless now, too little, too late, and tainted by the knowledge that she'd chosen comfortable denial over difficult truth when it mattered most. Some relationships, once broken, couldn't be repaired. Some trust, once lost, couldn't be restored. The elevator doors opened, and Jim Mitchell stepped out, looking older than his 68 years. The board had unanimously elected him to stay on as chairman, and he'd thrown himself into helping rebuild the company's reputation with the dedication of a man seeking redemption. "The new signage looks good," he said, studying the nameplate. "It feels good to exist again," I replied. We walked together toward the executive elevators, past employees who nodded respectfully, some with genuine warmth, others with the careful politeness of people still uncertain about the new power structure. I didn't blame them. They'd lived through 3 years of Vanessa's leadership, watching her systematically rewrite history and eliminate any trace of my contributions to the company. Trust would take time to rebuild. "The Portland project team wants to schedule a site visit next month," Jim said as we rode up to the 14th floor. "They're impressed with the sustainable construction methods we've been implementing." Those sustainable methods had been part of my original vision for the company innovations I'd been developing before my exile. Finding those old project files in the company archives had been like discovering buried treasure, ideas that were ahead of their time 3 years ago but perfectly aligned with current market demands. "Schedule it," I said, "and make sure the team knows this isn't just about one project. We're positioning ourselves as industry leaders in sustainable commercial construction." My office finally, truly my office, still smelled faintly of fresh paint. I'd had it completely renovated, removing every trace of Vanessa's occupancy. The furniture was new, the artwork carefully chosen, the layout designed to reflect both professional authority and personal authenticity. On my desk sat a framed copy of Dad's letter, the one that had started my journey back from exile. I read it sometimes when the weight of leadership felt overwhelming, reminding myself that even flawed people could choose truth in the end, even if it came too late. The phone rang at 11:30, a call I'd been expecting. "Madison, it's Patricia Williams from the DA's office. I wanted to let you know that we've recovered the last of the funds from Vanessa's offshore accounts. Full restitution has been completed. $347,000, plus interest and penalties. Money that would go toward employee bonuses and facility improvements. But more importantly, money that represented the final accounting of Vanessa's crimes." "Thank you, Patricia. I appreciate everything your office has done." "We should be thanking you. This case is going to be taught in law schools as a textbook example of how to build a fraud prosecution. Your documentation was extraordinary." After hanging up, I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked downtown Columbus. The city sprawled beneath me, full of buildings that Clark and Sons had helped construct over the decades. My father's legacy, my grandfather's legacy, and now mine to protect and build upon. The intercom buzzed. "Madison, there's a reporter from the Columbus Business Journal here to see you. Something about a follow-up story on the company's recovery." I smiled. The same publication that had tried to destroy me was now documenting my resurrection. There was a certain poetic justice in that. Send them up. This story would end differently than it began, not with exile and disgrace, but with truth vindicated and justice served, not with a family torn apart by lies, but with a company stronger for having survived them. Vanessa had taught me that blood meant nothing if it wasn't backed by honor. That family loyalty was worthless if it required sacrificing truth. That silence in the face of injustice was complicity, no matter how comfortable the lie might be. I'd learned those lessons the hard way, through 3 years of exile and loss. But I'd also learned something else: that integrity, once lost, could be reclaimed. That reputation, once destroyed, could be rebuilt. That truth, no matter how long buried, would eventually emerge. The nameplate downstairs would remain there long after I was gone, a testament to the woman who'd been written out of her own story but had returned to reclaim it. Madison Clark, co-founder and CEO, no longer an exile, no longer a victim, but the architect of her own vindication. Some battles are worth fighting, even when they cost everything. Some truths are worth defending, even when they destroy the comfortable lies that hold families together. And some stories don't end with forgiveness and reconciliation. They end with justice and the quiet satisfaction of a woman who refused to stay buried. Thank you for listening to this story of resilience and redemption. I'd love to hear where you're listening from and what this tale of fighting back against betrayal means to you. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage in the face of adversity. And let me know what stories from your own life have taught you about the power of truth. Your engagement helps us bring these powerful narratives to listeners around the world.